Hi, everyone. Welcome to this a very special episode 177 of the Manufacturing Hub. Today it's going to be Dave and myself discussing SCADA and MES applications. The reason why we're diving into this topic a little bit more today, more so, I guess, than we have in the past, is because next week we're doing a special event at ICC. For those of you that don't know, it is the Ignition Community Conference. It takes place every year. I don't know if it has taken place in a different location, but this year is going to be in Folsom, California. Tickets have been sold out for months. I think it's going to be a very interesting 3-day event packed about conversations about ignition, SCADA, MES systems, ERP systems, along with all the partners. And again, we're going to film and have a lot of conversations on site. A lot of them will be published. Some of them will be published next week. Some of them will be published a little bit later. That being said, our goal is always to bring you content that educates you around the industry, industrial automation, how to do things better. And we ourselves have a lot of questions for, those that convey that information. So we will be having, like I said, many conversations throughout next week. If you're going to be there, make sure to pass by and say hi. We have a schedule that Dave will go over in just a moment. That being said, like I said, if you want to talk to us outside of the filming times, more than happy to schedule a conversation with you. Or, like I said, just find us at the convention if you're going to be there. Dave, what does our schedule look like?
Absolutely. So super excited to be at ICC next week. If you guys are watching from afar or you've got online tickets, we have two lives currently planned. Monday, Vlad and I will be live, probably together, talking about some specifics, talking through some plans. Maybe we'll go through some particular topics that we're excited to see and watch. I am personally excited to watch 8.3, which is the official launch. I believe that's when we add time series data to to ignition to the community as a standalone module. So I'm excited to go watch that. So we'll go through a couple of specifics on Monday. Vlad and I together. You guys should see that event coming live, so you guys can sign up for the preview show later today or tomorrow. From that point, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, we've got filming all day lunchtime. We've got three special fun conversations that we currently have planned that we'll tape and be able to send out to you guys. We're going to talk about ignition from the international perspective. So we'll have Inductive Automation Australia with Francisco coming back on for his third or fourth episode. And then we'll have a couple of distributors come on to go talk about inductive automation and ignition kind of all across the globe, which I always find is a super fun part of the conversation. So that'll be Tuesday, tape delayed probably to the following week. On Wednesday, if you guys are live, come check us out in the media room. We're having a conversation surrounding partnerships. So we've got a couple of fun partner conversations coming on. And I got notification earlier that I think Colby is coming on to talk. I think he's going to kick us off to talk a little bit about 8.3. So we'll go ahead and confirm that. So we'll get him as part of that conversation as well. And then on Thursday, we're still working on a couple of specifics as to what that conversation is going to look like on tape delayed, but we've got a super fun conversation. We will be live almost immediately following the conference, probably about 90 minutes after the end of the keynote. We'll be live at the Seppasoft headquarters. So if you guys are around and want to come watch any of those shows, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday at the Harris Center, or Thursday if you want to come back and hang out for what should be a super fun kind of immediate post reaction and diving into a couple of special fun Seppasoft announcements that I'm not sure if we're able to talk about quite yet, which is why I'm not talking about them quite yet. Please come find us. You guys know what we look like. I'll probably be wearing an orange shirt for the entirety of the show. So come find us. Come find us. Come say hi. Go do all of those things. Without further ado, Vlad, you want to jump into the MES and SCADA conversation that we're having today?
Absolutely. So in a previous episode, Dave, and I'll have that in the show notes, which episode number it was exactly. We had a long discussion around IIoT, right? And how the
Mm-hmm.
integration landscape looks like when it comes to, I guess, like pulling out data from machines and sort of funneling that into whatever layer of the ISA stack you would like to see. That being said, today, based on next week's events, we do want to double down and have a more focused discussion around SCADA and MES specifically. But, in order to maybe take a step back, because I also don't want to assume that everyone knows what the definition of those systems are, I think we want to spend a couple of minutes just with the basic definition of what a SCADA system looks like, right? And I'm going to start that before I pass it on to you. So, SCADA, first of all, it's an acronym that stands for Supervisory Control and Data Acquisition. So, in my opinion, a SCADA becomes, I guess, a SCADA solution once it starts looking at multiple assets, right? So, you have an PLC and HMI combo that typically looks at a filler, at a palletizer, at a case packer, and that's going to be what I call an asset within the production line standpoint. And then a line is going to be multiple assets. And of course, an area and a plant is going to have multiple lines typically. Again, there's going to be exceptions depending on the industry. That being said, a SCADA, in my opinion, controls either multiple assets or controls multiple assets within multiple lines. So that's where the supervisory component comes in. Control, right? So a SCADA, again, is going to, in my opinion, give control that is going to be to a lesser detail than the PLC and the HMI of that specific asset, right? So if you can control, I don't know, maybe piston movements or delays or very specific items from an engineering standpoint, a SCADA is just going to tell all the assets to start sequentially, to process, like batches in a certain sequence.
Mhm.
So it's going to have a higher level of control than a standalone asset PLC and HMI. Data acquisition, again, so we've debated this a little bit, and we'll get into that quick debate about MES versus SCADA. So, a SCADA, in my opinion, only stores and acquires data that is raw from the system. It can certainly transform the data, but typically I've seen that more on the MES layer, where it's going to take, for example, the values of temperatures, of levels, of PID control loops, of batches, and then transform that to something a bit more readable or tangible for teams sitting, I guess, and controlling more of the operation side versus on the plant floor. So that's how I would maybe break the SCADA acronym down and define it. What are your thoughts, Dave?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that this is one of those fun acronyms that Vlad and I, to a large extent, agree upon, but to certainly to some extent we diverge upon. I would certainly agree. I would look at a SCADA, or I would generally call something a SCADA when we get above kind of the HMI level, right? So the HMI allows you to control the individual machine or cell. A SCADA is going to allow you to have some sort of control and or data visualization of multiple machines or cells. I have seen it broken out to, there's a line or a bunch of lines that are in one quote unquote kind of SCADA, and we can go dive into kind of specific set points. We can go change things. We can go see what those set points look like. And then from that point, we can go through the process of analyzing some of that data. I think historically, when we've looked at like the Purdue model, there is there is a differentiation or a delineation between what we see in SCADA and what we see in MES. From my perspective, I see kind of SCADA and MES merging and kind of slamming into each other. In fact, as we were going through and kind of building this out, I would almost put them either in the same or similar software packages and or kind of more so on the same level. As to if we want a quote unquote MES to go through the process of being able to change set points or other things and have some of that supervisory control is probably a different question and or different conversation than we're having now. But from my side, I think that we get into SCADA or SCADA and MES at the point that we've got multiple lines and are going through the process of having multiple lines and are going through some additional data looking and or kind of process of I'm losing the word that I'm looking for, Vlad. That when we go through having a bunch of different lines and we go through some math, when we go through the process of looking at different pieces of data and doing some comparing and contrasting.
Yeah, and I think, look, I think it's important not to get lost in semantics. I think that there's
Mhm.
certainly a lot of purists in industrial automation that will draw hard lines, but as you said, I think that depending on the industry, depending on the facility, depending on the management teams. There's a lot of blending of SCADA and MES systems. At the end of the day, it's also important not to get caught in the technology stack, because you can create an HMI that's going to control multiple lines. You can create an IPC that's going to control multiple lines, right? And so the debate, whether that's a SCADA,
Mhm.
an MES, or whatever else, can last for a very long time. So it's important to kind of look past that. I don't think it truly matters. I think what is relevant, is maybe the kind of features and the solutions it provides to the site and that specific organization, more so than the semantics of what do we call this thing that is software that lives within our network. So let's I guess, like, Dave, like, let's just kind of like move past the definition maybe of the system and ask some more specifics of, when you're deploying a SCADA or a SCADA and MES, maybe what kind of features are you hoping to see in that software package? Maybe what are the end users typically asking for, and or maybe what are some components that are critical, or and maybe even less critical to some of these deployments?
Absolutely. So I guess I look at deploying a SCADA more as business requirements than I look at it perhaps in historically what we have ISA 99, ISA 88, 88 batch, right? So I look at it as how can we get people to go through the process of using this? And a lot of the time, many of the conversations that I have on brownfield facilities, on facilities that have something, is almost painfully, we want it to look exactly like we know how to use the system that we currently have. Can you rebuild the system that we currently have yeah, can you rebuild the system that we currently have in a new software, right? Can we upgrade the software? Can we go through the processes that we need? And I find that that is kind of the biggest request most of the time, and it's certainly a double-edged sword, right? On one side, yes, we can actually absolutely go ahead and do that, but on the other side, we lose all of the additional value of going through and understanding what sort of workarounds do the operators have. And I feel like there are lots of workarounds that operators and operations folks have that we need to that they go through and just know this is how the system works. So we have to go do these 5 things to get the one step done that we need. So when I go through and look at deploying a SCADA, I like to go through and understand operational needs and operator requirements on it doesn't necessarily have to be a station by station basis, but what I find is that there are huge opportunities to go through and do it on a station by station basis. And let me go ahead and give you an example. So
Mhm.
a number of years ago, I was, and I'm thinking, I'm pretty sure it's the first SCADA the first full facility SCADA that was deployed across this facility that we're talking about. They had, I don't know, 4 or 5 dozen work cells over the course of 4 or 5 different buildings. They had a bunch of inventory. It was a very mature company that had just never gone through the process of collecting data, much less collecting data across all of the different all of the different stations. And so it was a SCADA and or SCADA HMI rebuild for many of the different stations, and going through looking at what one of the furnace operators was doing, he basically had to press what basically amounted to the same 14 buttons over and over again every time they needed to go run a batch. And it wasn't quite as simple as just collapsing all of those 14 buttons down into one particular button. It was going through the process of validating that it wasn't going to cause any problems and that all of the batches really were the same series of buttons, and shockingly they were. I don't know why anyone would go build it on the front end as they did build it, but it was how it was built. And so we went through the process of basically collapsing all of those or giving them a couple of different choices depending upon the different things that you're running, and that significantly reduced the number of buttons the operators needed to push because it reduced the amount of time so large we were able to actually go through the process of running an additional batch through the oven every day, which is crazy. The more times I think about it, the crazier it is that we lost hundreds of thousands of batches over the life of this
Mhm.
particular oven because of all the buttons we were pushing. but more importantly, it really got the operator and the operational staff on board as to what we were doing. And I find that's really important in order to find success in SCADA and or MES is going and working with the people who are going to be using it early to understand what their issues are. And once we go understand what their issues are, going and being able to go solve some of those problems so that they can help you determine what other problems might be so that the business cases can be defined as successful.
Yeah, I like that example, right? I think we've all been in situations where you go through a conversation with an operator and they explain to you
Mhm.
what needs to be done, and they just know, I guess, that sequence because they've been there for
Yep.
so long, and it's sort of tribal knowledge at that point. But then you're like, well, why can't we just automate or simplify this and reduce the learning curve for anyone that joins the team, which again is typically leading to low performance shifts for many reasons, for operator errors and such. So I definitely like that example. There's a good question, I would like
Mhm.
to take on that one. So Frederick on LinkedIn is asking, for brownfield, changing SCADA sometimes requires PLC changes and cost can be big. No. uh, as in, like, doesn't that require
Yeah.
big changes? So I've certainly worked on multiple conversions. To be honest with you, I think the short answer is that it depends, right? It depends on the
Yep.
conversion. Ultimately, I don't think that anyone goes through that process on a whim. I think that a
Hmm.
lot of funding needs to be secured in order to migrate systems, or there must be a reason. Either there's an acquisition of a certain company or a certain line or assets that are standardized on one piece of software and or hardware, and then you have something else that's on a different piece of
Hmm.
software and or hardware. You have a budget, you want to migrate onto a single platform, so you need to think through what the benefits are going to be, similar to what Dave, you'll describe. If there's issues
Hmm.
because there's so much complexity on this current platform and we're looking to either revamp the current one or maybe migrate to
Hmm.
something else, that could also be a
Yep.
reason to sort of evaluate, at the very least, what are some of the options on the market, and say,
Hmm.
well, like, look, we're going to either upgrade the current one, which is going to be cost X, or we're going to migrate to a different one, which of course is going to be cost Y. Um, do you need to change PLC code? In my opinion, in most instances, if you're just doing a pure migration, not really, because most SCADA systems talk to most platforms, unless there's something extremely specific and or maybe very obsolete, in which case I think that you probably need to be doing an audit of that hardware slash software stack to understand, maybe your platform is just so old that it requires a complete upgrade and not necessarily just PLC code changes, which again can lead to costs. But again, that is a whole other conversation on obsolescence, how you're getting replacement parts should those items failed. Out of many projects where the PLC, quote unquote, lost the code because of the old style battery supported PLCs. And so, long story short, it was time to upgrade. It was just impossible to connect to those old systems via any new SCADA and or MES solution. So I think it really depends. I think you always start with an audit. You need to understand what you currently have, where you're looking to go, what the costs are, and ultimately what you're going to get out of the migration. Because again, it is never just about, hey, we've moved from one platform to the other and we're running exactly the same way as we have in the past. What are your thoughts, Dave?
Absolutely. No, I agree to your comments and to Frederick's comments. It's a great question, especially in brownfield requirements. I guess in my experience, primarily doing this work in North America, the vast majority of the work I've done on older controllers has been on Rockwell, has been on PLC fives, right? And I feel like lots of people have seen lots of PLC fives. Depending upon what that is, there are different modules that you can buy that will allow you to go run Data Highway Plus, or basically go plug Ethernet
Yep.
in and go create that to a network. So I would say on the Rockwell side, on the PLC5 side, there are options. Sometimes there is some depending upon what the PLC is. So in my experience, if you're looking for a way to do it, starting at couple of $1,000s a module is what I think it was the last time I looked at it, but it's been a bunch of years since I've looked at what those modules look like. It is certainly much more cost effective than saying, hey, we've got to go through, I don't know, 50 or $100,000 of control system upgrade for every machine and go take those down. So in my experience, if you've got older PLC5s, that is the way that you'd go start. And then, kind of based upon that, it's once we have proven the value, then maybe we go start retrofitting some of the older machines off of those PLC5s onto new PLCs and go do that kind of slowly by slowly so that you can go through the process of upgrading. Because very infrequently are you able to go just rip out all of the controls and start over from scratch, despite how much fun that would be in and of itself. Having said that, most of the Siemens work that I have done in the past has been we will go through the process of upgrading Siemens controllers. And again, I think that's being US based. There just isn't nearly as much Siemens older controller work. I would say if you don't want to go through either of those processes and or don't have the time or budget or ability to go take down machines, I have seen groups put sensors. So less on the control side, but more on the data acquisition and or MES. I've seen groups run kind of additional series of sensors to the machines, be able to go collect that information, and then once we've acquired that information, Vlad doesn't like it. Vlad doesn't like it. We'll let Vlad say why he doesn't like it in just a moment. But I have seen groups do that, and then depending upon the machine, it's a way to go start collecting the data to show the value of the data. Now we'll let Vlad talk about why he hates that idea.
I try to reduce complexity as much as possible.
Mhm,
And look, I understand that it is a certain, I guess, shortcut to get things done. But I often find factories already filled with controllers that have unutilized IO and or are very easy to expand, right? You can add an additional input or output card where you can funnel the data through that controller into any system that you need. So I see how to say it, many groups shy away from doing that because
mhm,
again they're more comfortable. Hey, we're going to throw another controller that's going to collect these specific like three sensors. I've even, to
mhm,
be honest with you, Dave, I've seen controllers worth 3 to 5 grand connected
mhm.
to a single sensor that would literally pick up a box in front of it in
Yep.
order to funnel that data into a SCADA or I guess in that case an MES. And I understand why it is being done, but
Mhm,
I think it's just I guess the lazy approach and usually just results in more work down the line, right? Because now you have this new controller that needs to be on the network, that also
mhm.
needs to be quote unquote checked up on every now and then. It's an extra component that could fail. So like I said, I understand that there's complexity in these systems, but I think there's maybe better ways than
Mhm,
like throwing more hardware at it.
mhm.
But that's just again, it really depends on the industry, it depends on the organization. Sometimes you simply cannot avoid it, and like I said, I've been in those conversations as well. So that's just the nature of our industry.
Absolutely. I would say that this is one of the major differing points for Vlad and I. I feel like Vlad very much loves the Purdue model where everything goes up vertically. Whereas I have moved away from being quite that rigid. Because at the end of the day, sometimes groups can't take down lines. Sometimes you need to go through and add sensors in places that it doesn't make sense, or you have PLCs that are already full and you need to go collect that information. I think there are other ways of doing it, which we may
Those
or
are
may
edge
not get into.
cases. I think those are edge cases. I think in many instances you can change the code on your PLC live. You don't want to do it because it does present certain risk, right? So you're like, all right, I'm gonna put another one in.
Yeah, and I would say in many cases, mitigating the risk of causing issue on the PLC or the machine or the line is much less expensive than going and taking the line down because code doesn't change. I'm a big fan of the thought that code doesn't change itself. And if it's working, we know the code isn't changing. If the code does change, then Then it could be the code's fault, and now we've added all of this additional variability if and when we run into some issues.
And look, that's a huge. I can't remember who I was talking to, right? But we agreed on one point. That's a huge rite of passage when it comes to OT systems. You need to
Mhm.
be able to tell a story where you've shut down an entire line because of a change you've made on a PLC. And I think it's I'm gonna paraphrase, I guess, what the person said, but it's almost if you've never made that happen, it's as if like
Mhm.
you're not pushing enough code into production, so to speak. So if anything, you can take that as an opportunity to have a tiny risk where you're like, man, I have this crazy story where the whole line shut down and there was spillage all over the place, and it took 4 hours to clean it up. So
And this is your weekly reminder of please do not push untested code into production.
I mean, who tests code on the OT side? That's unheard of.
No one in
But
this conversation, Vlad. Obviously,
exactly.
no one, no one in this conversation.
All right, we'll move past that. So let me ask you a, I guess, more difficult question. Where does a SCADA system actually live? Right, we talked about software, we talked about
Mhm.
hardware. I think there's many ways to skin a cat, so to speak. So where do you see these SCADA systems actually being deployed? And I guess like when I say where, I'm talking like hardware. Where do you see them live?
Absolutely. I guess in my experience, I've seen them deployed in a number of different places, but my preferred area is if not line side server, then facility side server. Preferably in the building that the machines are physically running. I have worked with too many groups that there have been issues. There have been fiber optic or other intranet issues where lines get cut either inside the facility or in the parking lot or outside the facility, which could, in theory, decapitate the facility or the different buildings within that group if it's not run within the same building. So, my preference is in the building that the machines and or lines are running. Sometimes that means that you have to have multiple SCADA servers across a facility with a bunch of different buildings. Most of the time, I find that as a good risk mitigation tool. So, that is my best experience. That is the way to reduce as much risk as possible. But I have seen it everywhere from that to one quote unquote SCADA server running a whole bunch of buildings, either within a particular compound. Every once in a while, I will see kind of an intranet. Every once in a while, I'll see an internet kind of being shared by like micro waves. Between microwaves between two buildings, like a block or a couple of blocks away, or across a river. Every once in a while, I will see it hosted in the cloud and maybe an edge server running the line itself. I have seen problems across every one of these. So that's why it's my preference to mitigate the risk as much as possible and put the server as close to the building and as close to the line as possible. How about you,
Yeah.
Vlad?
I I look, I definitely believe that there is a need for computing slash processing power as close as possible to the lines.
Mhm.
Obviously, I think the debate to be had is, do you have, let's call it, an edge device per line that aggregates some information and then forwards that to maybe like a central location. I think that's only if you have some kind of a very high speed process and you're looking to collect data that maybe is going to how do you call it, bottleneck on your network.
Mhm.
So if you want to do some fancy processing, I think it makes sense. I've actually talked to a gentleman who's working across like multiple factories in the pharma industry, and his
Mhm.
frustration has been with the IT side not fully understanding some of the OT requirements, which again is a whole conversation we've had multiple
Mhm.
times. Long story short, what they're doing is they are deploying a MES slash SCADA system. I would say it's less, to control the lines, but more to get the data out, but also to, adjust some of the process. So it's doing minor control. So I would call it more of an
Mhm.
MES than a SCADA in this case. What they're struggling with is they deployed no edge devices, so they're going straight from PLCs into the cloud. And as you can imagine, they're having a lot
Mhm,
of issues with the networks at different factories. They're having a ton of issues with, the
mhm,
ISP, the internet service providers.
mhm.
They're having issues with cloud. Obviously, depending on how you build your architecture, a lot of these solutions are not meant to be containerized yet, right? And I say yet, I think it's going to only get
Yeah.
better, but they're using this interesting European-based solution, which is definitely not made for that. So
Mhm,
again, there's a team of DevOps slash like cloud engineers who piecemeal that solution that is having balancing problems and
mhm,
traffic problems. So what I'm trying to say is I am a firm believer that there needs to be a buffer at the
mhm,
edge, if for nothing else but just to store data temporarily in order to forward that to a
mhm.
central location, which can be on site. Ideally it is on site, or it can be in the cloud. Again, I know that many organizations will have an aggregate, of different facilities in addition to sort of the local SCADA. But again, that's more of an MES again than a SCADA. I would say it's more for data than to control the lines. So I agree with you. I think that there's many solutions, and look, we've talked about this a little bit to bring the topic from next week, and can pull up this page really quickly. um, Ignition or inductive
Mhm.
automation has a number of different layouts, right? So this is as simple as you can put a Raspberry Pi that you can see behind me. You can deploy Ignition Edge, and in theory, you could control a couple of machines, right? So that becomes your SCADA system. You can then access it via computers, mobile devices. It's a web-based solution, so it doesn't really matter how you get to it. It has a database. Again, a Raspberry Pi is not going to give you a whole lot, but it can certainly store data for a little bit. And then moving that along, as we discussed, this is going to be maybe a larger solution where you have multiple servers. Again, an aggregate that is closer to the line, and probably this front end gateway is where obviously it does networking, but also maybe stores some more long term process data, versus these are kind
Yep.
of like the edge solutions. And there's different architectures. I encourage anyone who's maybe interested or curious about different ways to integrate a SCADA slash MES. I think there's different options laid out very well, but ultimately, yes, like you can go from very basic to extremely complex. And if that's what your organization needs, there's certainly a layout for it.
Absolutely. I think they've got a lot of very good graphics. I think they've got a lot of really good graphics as to how some of us would deploy if it's one for one for some of those graphics, or if we'd add a little bit, kind of move things around, is a different conversation.
Sure.
Again, and I think when we have that conversation, it's especially for enterprise customers, especially for customers that have a bunch of different sites and or a bunch of different lines. And Vlad, you and I have talked about data contextualization over and over again. The question always becomes, do we contextualize our data, in this instance, in the ignition instance, at a level below pushing everything into the OPC server or MQTT server for ignition? Or do we do it at that level? Or do we perhaps do it above that level before it goes to a central server, and or before we go push it to the cloud? I think we see more and more the need, and I think the vast majority of people agree that we need to go through the process of contextualizing this data and normalizing this data so that especially enterprises can go make those decisions. I think it's less important at one site, one line. I think the more lines you get within that site, or and the more similar widgets, the more similar products, the more similarity of the lines there are, the more important it is that there's contextualization. But once you get above two, three, five, or more facilities who are making similar things or who are making things, you want to be able to have some general understanding across the enterprise what's going on. So there's certainly some need to contextualize this information, which is probably the least fun of any of these processes. I don't know if anyone in the chat has gone through this or are considering going through this. It's not a particularly fun job. There are tools that you can use, but there's always going to be probably 20% of the tags that may be running and you have no idea what's going on, or the quality is bad, or the quality is non-existent, right? So there's always some significant amount of manual work as you go through and contextualize from facility to facility.
Yeah, and look, I would say that my current stance, right, and obviously might change in the future, is that it doesn't necessarily matter that much if you contextualize at the edge or you
Mhm,
contextualize, in the cloud or wherever the database lives. I think what's important is to have a process and a standard, as long as, there's not multiple people reinventing that standard and
mhm,
following their own or different standards. I think that's where you run into problems a lot. Obviously, as you mentioned, if it's a simple or a small system, it matters even less. Where I think
mhm,
it starts mattering is, once you set up your data pipelines, whatever again your definitions are, if you start sending context along with your tag, it adds quite a bit of traffic on that network. So, but again, it's only going to really matter for very large organizations. If you're a site that's only starting to collect data, I really think that you can start with one model and then shift to the other one down the road. It really depends who's going to utilize that data, who's going to understand the schema that you've set up, and
mhm,
how complex maybe your process and your site is. Because ultimately, I think what contextualization um, truly I guess adds or is required for is someone who doesn't understand the facility, someone who doesn't understand the process or hasn't been there, needs to make sense of that data or transform that data into more like MES style, like reports or
mhm.
batching or what have you, or even on the data side, trying to create some predictive maintenance or analytics or what have you. If they don't know what the data is, they're going to make absolutely no sense of it. So I think that as long as they understand the schema and the person sending the data understands the schema, I think it should be fine, regardless where it is generated in most cases.
I think that's interesting. I think the more of these projects I do, and the more of these projects I review, and the more of these projects that I consider looking at what does it take to go scale from one line across the facility and then from one facility to dozens of facilities, I continue to come back to the conclusion that the lower, the better. And I say that because we talk about building modules, we talk about building repeatable code across lines and across facility. So, um, so as we go through the process of talking about that, we'll go back to the ignition example, right? So if I want, a dashboard to work across all of my lines, if I want to be able to use all of my pump widgets and kind of everything that I've built throughout all of this, then if I contextualize and or normalize my data before it gets into ignition, I know that it should work immediately. And there might be a couple of edge cases that we need to go change. But if I don't do that, then I have to manually go map all of those tags one to one. And then I still have to go through the process of doing the contextualization and normalization above that ignition server in this instance. And so
I
that is why
Yeah.
I think the larger you get as an organization, the more important it is to do as low as possible. Like, I would love if we could go convince all of our equipment manufacturers to go use the same tag names, but I feel like that is almost certainly not possible. Um, yeah,
Yeah.
I feel like that is almost certainly not possible.
I think, look, again, my thought on that is I think that's more of an organizational slash, relationship slash like how
Yes.
people work issue than anything else. It's one of those things where, if you get people to do it at the beginning, they'll actually do it because it's part of the project. But if the data is already in ignition and Vlad is an absolute madman who left like zero tag names and gave them cryptic names that only he understands, the chances of you getting me back on to decipher what that is, in a year is slim to none, right? So I think it's all about kind of like what those relationships look like. And I think there's tons of
Mhm.
examples in software on that side as well. If
Mhm.
you get the developers to write, and I think Google released an entire, it's not called a playbook, but I think it's how to write good code. So if
Okay.
you follow the structure, then you will always end up with a better result once you scale that code than if you were to, I guess, try and refactor what's already been built. So yes, like I agree, like at the beginning, it's
Mhm.
always better, but I think like in the grand scheme of things, from like a technical standpoint, I don't think it like truly matters as long as everyone's on the same page. Where like again, are is everyone on the same page? That's a whole other debate. Let me move us a little bit past that,
We've
right?
got a
So I
couple
think
of comments. We've got a couple of comments that I want to throw up. Uh,
all right.
Isham is talking about how he's seen oil and gas facilities that have substations connected to the control room through fiber optic links to the SCADA system. I've seen oil and gas facilities do this. I've also seen other facilities do this. It's fantastic until someone cuts through a fiber wire, and then it takes 3 weeks to go get those replaced. But fiber is probably the most stable of any that I've seen. I was actually at a facility last year, a year and a half ago, that the main trunk, the main fiber trunk, when someone was making the connection to the main switch, um, they damaged one of the fiber lines, and it took about a week and a half of troubleshooting until they went to swap those fiber lines in order to figure out that that was the problem. And we don't even want to guess how costly that was for the facility. And then
How was it that
Allie,
long?
that's a story that is longer than the rest of the show, Vlad. We can go talk about that offline. Allie is on YouTube, so if you guys don't know Manufacturing Hub, we always stream on our YouTube channel. So if you guys are not shared, subscribe to that, please go ahead and do that. Got a bunch of people on YouTube, more and more. She says, "Thanks for the live." Or Allie says, "Thanks for the live. Does Ignition
Could also
have
be a
the
heat, to
MES
be
and
honest with you.
yes?" So Allie, sorry, Allie. Yes, I apologize, Allie. Um, if I said she when I meant he and all of those other things. Let me go stop fumbling over my words and answer the question. Does Ignition have their MES inherently embedded in their server? So I guess the it's a complicated answer. I'm going to try to uncomplicate it as much as I completely can. So Inductive Automation, the company that makes Ignition, does not make their own MES. They have a strategic partner in Sepasoft who builds the MES modules that kind of seamlessly connect, that are what we would consider Ignition MES. You can have Sepasoft running their modules on separate servers. You just have to go ahead and make those links. I have run those on separate servers from the Ignition SCADA for a variety of different reasons, but there are also a variety of other groups who make their own MES. Yeah, there are also other groups who make their own MES, and I don't know the answer to those. So I guess long story short, if you're talking about the Sepasoft MES, it does not have to be on the same physical server as the Ignition is. If you're talking about some of these other groups and looking to buy their flavors of MES, I cannot answer that question. Thank you for that. And then we've got Mark O'Donovan. Oh, Vlad, you got a comment.
Sure. Yeah, I guess I'll talk on the Mark question.
Okay.
Um, so Mark is asking, well, I guess he's saying, I worked with one automation director who enforced standard AOIs in the PLC linked to standard UDTs in the SCADA, and it really worked out so well. I will say that that is I guess, the purpose of UDTs and AOIs in a very broad sense. I've personally seen them, I want to say, like fail or be rejected more than succeed. I think that on the integrator side, I've seen many instances where, equipment is being sent out with just a bunch of nested AOIs and a bunch of
Mhm.
nested UDTs. And if you come from the Rockwell world, at least, those are incredibly, and again, I can write any code that becomes incredibly difficult to troubleshoot, but unless you
Mhm.
unless you provide good documentation, I think they just become so redundant and so, how to say, like they're trying to embed everything into an AOI and UDT that becomes incredibly difficult to manage. But I agree with what Mark is saying. When used correctly, I think they provide a layer of abstraction where you can easily see where the connections are, what's talking to what. You can very easily deploy a SCADA on top of a solution that has proper structures inside of PLCs versus if not, you're going to be linking to individual tags, which can take a lot of time. So when used properly, I think it's great.
Absolutely. I would agree. I would agree with that. When used properly, they're great. When used improperly, you'll probably never be able to troubleshoot the code.
Yep.
But having said that, I am a big fan of AOIs and UDTs. And I find that the vast majority of people who are talking about AOIs and UDTs are generally using them properly. Sometimes when you get to like the fourth programmer um, down the level from that, that's where you get some confusion or maybe some poor data hygiene. And so that doesn't work out quite as well. Before I throw it back to Vlad to ask the next question, I do want to say, guys, we're live. If you're hanging out with us live, thank you so much. We've got, I don't know, 2 or 3 dozen folks hanging out with us at the moment across a whole bunch of platforms. Please feel free to say hi. Please tell us where you're at. Tell us if you're heading to ICC, if you're going to see Vlad and I next week. And again, if you guys have any questions, comments across this, please go ahead and drop it live. We do our very best to go answer these to the best of our ability. Vlad, back to you.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think an important item, and maybe we will have some discussion around, is who typically uses a SCADA versus an MES, and also who
Mhm.
typically maybe maintains and sort of augments over the long term a SCADA and an MES. What are your thoughts?
I mean, I feel like I should answer the second part first and say no one maintains it. But that's a different question than who should maintain it. But let's go talk about users first. So I find that especially once you get into, I guess I see a couple of things, right? So I see lots of power users. So good organizations have power users. I feel like the power user at the level, it almost doesn't matter because I've seen engineers be power users. I've seen operation managers and leaders be power users. I've seen data analysts and other people, depending upon where you are in the organization, be power users. And those guys are generally going in, and if it's writing their own SQL queries, or if it's transporting out to a Power BI dashboard, or if it's using kind of like ad hoc trending and other things within the specific tool, I think that those guys and girls are absolutely fantastic at what they do. They are generally the people that help move things forward. I find a lot more people who are using it are running kind of very specific reports, and I find that those reports, right, wrong, or indifferent, are where lots of things get moved within the facility. So it might be, hey, what was our throughput? What was our uptime versus downtime? What was our quality? How many cases did we make over the last 24 hours? Hopefully, it's once a day that we're having these meetings. Sometimes it's once a week or beyond that we're having the meetings. And I find that there's a huge difference between the static and dynamic users. Right, the dynamic users are going in, finding a problem. Once they've found a problem, they are generally going to try to figure out what happened and how we can go mitigate these issues. The static groups in our general reporting and meetings like that are, hey, this was an issue, let's everyone go back and research this issue. Of course, none of us have the live information or data with us, so let's take our paper, let's go back, let's research the issue. And then they typically go round and round for a couple of days or forever and never solve the issue. So I think we see kind of both of those groups: static reports, more power dynamic users, either with tools that exist and are built on the platform, or going and exporting and using that information themselves. I could continue on, but I want to go get your thoughts on the topic, Vlad.
I think, look, my take is a little bit different, right? So again, to me, a SCADA based on the definition is not going to be utilized by, let's call it, upper management, right? So a SCADA, to
Hmm.
me, the visual that I could paint for someone who's listening is, Homer Simpson sitting in front of a bunch of buttons and a bunch of dials and, like ways to control the production of that facility, right? So a SCADA to
Mhm.
me is primarily utilized by operators up to, let's call it, supervisors. And again, if there's obviously like big problems or issues, maybe by ops managers. Whereas
Okay.
an MES, again, to my original like definition, will process the raw information and present reports, right? Like we talked about batch reports.
Mhm.
We've talked about, on the incoming into the system side, recipe control, right? Where you could select different recipes for different products. And I think that's where the upper management will care a lot more and the operators
Mhm.
would care a lot less, right? Because when you're coming in for your shift on a Monday morning, you don't really care what happened or what the average was in terms of production for the last month as an operator, but you do care, what the outages were on the night shift or on the graveyard shift before you came in. So you have your daily direction setting meeting or whatever it's called in, different Lean Six Sigma organizations, and so your priorities are much more short term versus, an MES is going to spit up some analytics that management cares about consumption of raw materials, I guess maybe output of finished goods, versus on the line, you typically will track, let's say, production on target or off target for the current shift, but
Mhm.
you're not going to you're not going to necessarily track all the SKUs throughout the month and really care about kind of dynamics that happen in a factory over maybe a weekly, monthly, and or yearly basis. So I think that's where the split for me happens, where like SCADA and sort of below is a lot more centered towards
Mhm.
sort of like short term vision versus anything that's MES and above is a lot more longer term vision. And I think the groups there are very different for that reason.
Absolutely, I would agree. Short term, you certainly see folks who are in the weeds working on the line all day, every day. I think kind of hopefully the longer term, you are seeing more executive leadership looking at that. Although I've certainly seen it kind of both ways of executive leadership being in the hour by hour or day to day, and the some operators that I know the numbers per shift over the course of months or years better than any executive or general manager that
Sure.
works at that facility. But I absolutely, I would agree. Most of the time, you're not seeing lots of operators, maybe even like sometimes you see shift leads and kind of shift leadership getting into that MES because sometimes lots of their KPIs are tracked to that, but certainly not the day-to-day operations folks. I would in fact say lots of the day-to-day operations folks are probably not going to get into the SCADA, right? Like they may
Yeah.
see some trends to your point, Vlad. Typically, and I don't know where they always get the information. They know exactly what the previous shifts did. They know exactly how much first shift has to do resetting for third shift because third shift caused issues. Um, but absolutely agree.
Good. I think this transitions us into the next topic on which, Mark already made a comment. So, Mark in the comments on LinkedIn is saying, I think how many times I've developed recipe management, batch reporting, OE, and downtime tracking in SCADA platforms, right? And this goes back to the earlier comment that I made is ultimately I see these as maybe disjointed from the technology side because you can nowadays with the power of controllers, computers, whatever you want to call them, you can build whatever you want on any piece of hardware and or software, right? Like your IPC could run Linux, your Raspberry Pi can become an entire ERP, right? But it ultimately depends what the goal is, what the purpose is, what industry you're in. So I think you can certainly build out a lot of applications in, I want to say, anywhere, but it is important to also understand, and I will say that, maybe the non-industrial automation knowledgeable people don't always fall into those problems until they do happen. So scalability is one of those topics that we've discussed. Just because you've built something on a PLC that makes sense doesn't necessarily mean that it can easily replicate to a different
Mhm.
facility. So now you have to go back to the drawing board, and until you've seen maybe that failure, you don't realize that maybe you should have used something off the shelf running in a different way. But again, I'm not saying it cannot be done. I just think it certainly starts to create other bottlenecks. Um, any thoughts on that, Dave?
I would generally agree with kind of all of the thoughts. I see lots of recipe batch reporting, downtime tracking, all those things. I absolutely have, similar to Mark, done lots of that development in SCADA. That is, to your point, Vlad, absolutely where I think it should be, as opposed to on the individual controller or perhaps on the individual HMI. So I would agree with all of that. I think they're all really good points. Again, I think that when you start to get into like specifics, you're talking about, hey, what does this organization feel like? Some organizations want all of the batch information living on a PLC and want to spend the extra money for all of the extra storage and RAM in order to be able to go build and store all of that information on the specific PLC. I feel like we move away from those to give us more flexibility, but I guess there are some organizations who really want to go store that all at the edge that is the PLC as opposed into the SCADA. Right, wrong, or indifferent. Again, I see going and building everything so that we can go through the process of kind of standardizing and reducing as much hardware specific requirements as possible, which is something that
Yeah.
we haven't particularly gotten into. And I'm not sure that this is the week for us to go ahead and get into that. But I want to ask you challenges, mistakes that you've seen during deployment. I don't know if you've got any good. I don't know if you got any good stories of like positive things. I don't know if you have any horror stories that you want to go through the process of telling. But tell us a little bit about some of the challenges and maybe some of the mistakes that you've seen.
Sure. Yeah, and I guess like before we get into specifics, right? Like I think it's important to paint maybe the bigger buckets of what a deployment typically takes. Number one, I think it takes a very thorough assessment. I think that the mistake being made on that side is not realizing what you need in terms of retrofits, and we've answered a question that was pertaining to that in order to get the system or the new SCADA or MES up and running. So a lot of times there's quite a bit of overhead work on upgrading controllers, making sure that everything's actually connected to the network, right? So someone's going to tell you, hey, everything's great. We've got all these connections. You can pull the data right out. You can connect and ping all of these devices. You go on site, and that's not really the case. So you start spending a lot of time understanding the networking side. You need to spend a lot of time. Again, I think we talk in generalities when we talk about upgrading controllers, but it can get fairly complex. What I mean by that is, it's not just about moving from, behind me here on the wall, you have the L61 control
Hmm.
logics, and so that can run up to version 20 of or I guess like up to version 20 of the firmware, which ultimately results in a RS Logix version 20 only running on that specific controller. Well, what happens is
Hmm.
if you just want to upgrade to an L71 or an L81 or whatever, like I guess within those lines, it doesn't only mean that you upgrade the controller only. You have to go and through and read through the documentation. A lot of times it could be also upgrading your drives, upgrading certain IO points, upgrading the code, right? As someone said, like sometimes you do need to make changes in order to make the systems work. So I think the biggest mistake that I've seen being made is not spending enough time on that first step in order to truly understand what it will take, and then sort of halfway in realizing like, oh, now we need to invest a lot more time. Now there's more delays. There's not enough budget to complete all those items. And so you get stuck in this perpetual, 3, 5 year migration that you
Hmm.
thought was going to take 3 to 6 months. So I
Yep.
think that's by far the biggest mistake. And I've experienced it multiple times. Again, as a contractor or as a consultant for some of those companies, they simply hadn't brought in the teams that fully understand those requirements. And I think that many people, in our industry will tell you that they can do an assessment, and you can certainly, go online, punch in the part number, and you will get some information. But you
Mhm.
need, I think, that core competency, which is having been on some of those projects to see what could go wrong and be able to navigate that during the process.
Absolutely. I would 100% agree. I think that the biggest mistake that I see over and over again, and I would say certainly more than 50% of the groups that I see and talk to have done this at least once, is not spend the time and money to make sure that everything is in place, especially with a reasonable timeline. And I see lots of times like requirements documents, more so outside of just like the physical hardware, right? Like there are some hardware limitations. Hardware might need to be upgraded, um, but I see lots of times not understanding the technical requirements, and sometimes that may be a corporate team who doesn't understand the requirements of a site, and maybe they're led by someone who understands that. Lots of times I'll work with directors or vice presidents that do understand this process. They just won't have a team in place internally to be able to go write those requirements and to be able to go through that process. So
Mhm.
from my side, I think spending the time and the money, making sure that you have everything set, making sure that you have reasonable expectations. And it may mean spending a couple of extra weeks or a couple of extra months making sure that you have all of the requirements and everything written, and written to the point of we all agree. Lots of times I will go read reports, and these 10 things or these 20 things that are called out or not called out in the report were critical in the first 45 minutes of conversation that I had with a client. I don't understand why they are or are not in this. And sometimes a phase one versus phase two is, I'm not sure you guys are able to run as built on phase one. Why wouldn't we just add a couple of other things into phase one in order to be able to go run and collect the information? And that almost exclusively ends with feeling the pressure to need to go kick this thing off because it was a key metric to go kick the project off, which means
Mhm.
that the project is going to overrun by 200% of time and money. And you might be a year or two or three later, and it's just never complete and it's not getting to the point. And now maybe you're getting to the back end of the project, looking at some of these early thoughts or hopes or expectations and seeing that it does or does not correlate with everything. So I would 100% agree with you. Spending the time, spending the money, having someone on the outside or having someone internally who understands intimately this process to be able to go help build these plans, thoughts, requirements, timelines, and then go be able to have the gut check of, yes, this is 3 weeks of work, or no, this is 5 months of work given where you currently are. So you aren't sold or internally buy into the process if we can do this in a much shorter time period. And all of those big challenges. And we can talk about lots of those misses, but I feel like more of those misses are not things that we can talk about live, on air for clients' sake.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say, maybe again in generalities, some of the other failures, I think, well, I guess like number two, change management, right? I think
Hmm.
that very often these projects are not, a one-to-one rip and replace. The goal is always to augment the system or to create a way to benefit more from either the data or the process, or, like automate certain parts of the factory. A lot of
Hmm.
times I think that there's a big disconnect between, what people want to do versus what people actually sort of receive, and they become frustrated by not getting involved early enough on in that process, that they don't understand, they don't go through the learning curve, they don't care, they don't trust the data, so on and so forth. And so even though that the project from a technical standpoint has been successful,
Hmm.
that change management component just throws so much, I want to say, sticks in the wheels, that it becomes
Yep.
extremely difficult to overcome. And a lot of facilities will just succumb, again, like halfway through that project. Well, all right, like we don't want to do this anymore, let's just go back to what we had, and kind of call it quits. But it does take a lot of effort from the people side and the training side, and like I said, data, maybe validation side, in order to make sure things are I guess worse a little bit short term, but become better long term. And I think that too many facilities just don't have that. Well, I don't want to say too many facilities. I want to say like some facilities don't have the grit to go through that process, right? And again, there's a lot of details and things to unpack there, but it is one sticking point that I have found again myself in many conversations on that side.
Absolutely. I 100% agree, and I feel like even large parts of our conversation today are talking about technical requirements, and we haven't touched on the people side, right? There is huge parts of these projects, and honestly, at the end of the day, these projects are change management. They're people. If you don't have the buy-in from different and particular groups, if the groups just flat out refuse to go through the process of working or doing some of these things, then at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter, right? It doesn't really matter because the projects, to a large extent, are doomed. I've talked about projects in the past. One that had all of the issues that we've talked about so far today, including the fact that the person who built the requirements was assumably in a windowless room because they talked to absolutely no one on the floor to understand how any of these things were built. And after I don't know, a 6 month or a 4 month project that took 3 years and 10x the budget to go through and build, it all came down to the scheduler and the conversation. To my understanding, basically went, "This is the way we're scheduling now." They looked at the scheduler, looked at the everyone else, said no, and the multiple millions of dollars project just died because they were no one was going to go through the process of saying, "Hey, we have to go and do this. This is critically important to our organization." And you lost, huge swaths of everything we talked about because everything was built at this core component of we have to schedule everything in the system. And if the scheduler isn't going to schedule everything in the system and we don't have change management in place to allow us to go through the process of doing this, then nothing. Then there's a failure, kind of all across the board.
Dave, I will say, in order maybe to be respectful of everyone's time, I will start wrapping us up. I will say that if you are an end user or someone who's interested in more conversations around SCADA, MES, industrial automation, manufacturing, and all of those topics, then make sure to reach out to us. I think we're always interested in guests as well as sponsors as well that we can bring on the show to have these conversations. I think if you're going to be next week at ICC, make sure to pass by and say hi. I think it's going to be a really good event. I hope to learn a lot. And yeah, any last thoughts, maybe last comments before we take off, Dave?
Absolutely. But before we wrap it up, I'd like to congratulate Vlad. I think this is the third time he has pitched anything. And we're episode 177. 178, Vlad is going to be the salesperson for the show. Everything runs
Right.
through Vlad. Vlad, congratulations. Thank you for going through the process of doing that. But no, everyone, thanks for coming and hanging out. We had a bunch of folks in the chat, we had a bunch of folks in the comments. We got to at least the majority of questions that I was able to see here on Restream. If y'all are at ICC next week, as Vlad said, reach out. Looking forward to go have this conversation. Maybe we'll continue some of this Greenfield versus Brownfield conversation at one of the streams next week. If not, we will at some point have to have this conversation because we've been talking about having this conversation for so long. If you guys have made it this far, make sure you're connected to Vlad and myself and following Manufacturing Hub. A bunch of you guys have found Manufacturing Hub on the YouTube. We will continue to go through streaming there. That's a really good place to go find all of these streams. Vlad's done an awesome job on SEO. If you Google Manufacturing Hub and almost any topic, we are like right at the very top of Google for the vast
Really?
majority of these things. Yes, that is actually how I go find episodes. In fact, Vlad had mentioned our IIoT conversation. I Googled it. It was episode 168, which if you guys are in chat and or the show notes and or YouTube or any of these other streams, you guys can scroll back up to the top and find the YouTube link to episode 168. If you guys have made it this far on podcast form, you are awesome. Please do the like, share, subscribe, all of those other fun things. We will wish everyone an adieu today, Wednesday, and see everyone live Monday at a very different time, still to be determined. Monday, the 16th, we'll see everyone throughout the course of the week, and then we'll see you again live